Welcome back, brothers, to Warhammer. Tonight, Perturabo is trying to get even with Fulgrim for using him during his transformation. Before we get into that, just be sure to like and comment any videos and topics you want to see in the future. Be sure to subscribe from Emperor. Now, I want to thank you guys for the support. Now, let's get to the video.
Medrengard did not know silence. It knew the groaning of chained continents. It knew the coughing thunder of macro forges vomiting black smoke into a lightless sky. It knew the clatter of unnumbered labor gangs in iron collars, the animal shrieking of things that had once been human and were now fit only to pull shell carts through arsenic mud, and the patient hammering of warsmiths whose craft had outlived empires. It knew the muttering of data psalms from rusted cogitator shrines. It knew the hungry murmurs of bound engines dreaming in their vaults of release and slaughter. It knew agony measured, apportioned, harvested. It knew obedience beaten into matter itself. It knew its lord. The infinite citadel rose over the poisoned plains like a verdict-made architecture. No grace touched it. No vanity softened its lines. It was not beautiful, save in the manner of a siege gun, absolute in purpose, murderous in design, every angle a denial of weakness. Its towers were black iron and demonic brass. Its battlements bristled with batteries vast enough to unmake flotillas. Its walls were veined with furnace light and the trapped glow of infernal geometries. The dead were mortared into its foundations. The living were wired into its systems. Its machine spirits dreamed in a language of equations, screams, and iron. In its highest galleries, where the air tasted of hot metal and old blood, Perturabo stood before a hololithic array the size of a cathedral nave and watched a world die twice. The first death had been useful. He had marked the world for reduction and later integration into the widening glacis of his greater design. It had sat upon a useful vector out from the Cadian marches, its ore vaults deep, its moons fortified but not beyond taking, its orbital plate yards of serviceable capacity. Its hives were ugly, its soldiery was mediocre, its system traffic could be pressed into war convoys once the population had been culled and sorted. It had been no prize. That was precisely why it had value. Perturabo did not build with jewels, he built with stone. The second death had been obscene. The hololith showed him what Fulgrim's sons had left behind. Continents burned in patterns too symmetrical to be accidental. Hive clusters had been opened like meat by precision bombardment, not to break resistance, but to sculpt the ruins into vast spirals visible from orbit. The dead had not been rendered, stacked, counted, or fed into reclamation crucibles. They had been arranged. Whole districts glittered with sonic vitrification, towers melted into smooth curves and impossible arches. Chemfogs bloomed in lurid veils over charnel plazas, where millions had been herded, flayed, intoxicated, vivisected, and left to die shrieking into amplifiers. Shipyards he had intended to claim were gutted, not for sabotage, but for harvest. Bodies gone, drug vaults emptied, resonance engines stolen. The world's scream had been turned from data into performance. Lesser being might have named the sensation within him rage. Perturabo did not insult himself with lesser words. His gaze remained fixed as new streams of intelligence crawled over the hololith. Rune after rune, cipher after cipher, each one confirmed the insult. Emperor's children war hosts, multiple vectors, short occupation, maximum mutilation, precision theft of narcotics, flesh stock, sonic reliquaries, and void dock machine cores, ritual debasement of command shrines, deliberate ruin of logistic value. A message then, not to the corpse emperor, to him. He raised one gauntleted hand. The runes froze in place. His hand was a weapon fit for the ending of citadels. Black iron plated the swollen, unnatural enormity of the limb, chased in hazard striping old as treachery, its edges glowing with a furnace red that never dimmed. Cables like bundled serpents ran from wrist to elbow. The armor over him was no longer armor in the mortal sense. It was plate, fortress, skin and prison, in one. His silhouette was titanic, broad enough to shame a dreadnought, every surface engraved with kill calculi, siege formulae, and profane catechisms. Horns curved from his helm like the crowned iron of a war idol. Furnace light pulsed in the slits of his faceplate. He was colossal, monstrous, and yet not given to the degeneracy of his brothers. There was no wasted ornament upon him, no peacock vanity, no bestial slobbering madness. His corruption had not made him less himself. It had given his bitterness mass. "He has done it again," he said. The words were low. They rolled through the gallery like distant bombardment. All around him the chamber worked. Captives wired into predictive cogitators spasmed in their restraint rigs, eyes burning with white data glare as streams of future probability ruined their minds. Servo skulls shrieked binaric confirmations. Data screeds unreeled from brass mouths in the walls. Chained engines muttered in recessed alcoves, their furnace bellies glowing behind bars thick as tank hulls. Above, the ceiling was lost in smog and incense and heat shimmer. Perturabo turned from the hololith and walked. The gallery floor shook under each step. Not from haste. Never from haste. It was simply that so much malice, so much will, now wore a shape large enough to make fortifications feel frail. Iron servitors and branded human thralls hurled themselves face first to the deck as he passed. A chained battle engine, half awake in its vault niche, uttered a growl from behind iron bars. Perturabo did not look at it. It felt his presence and fell silent of its own accord. He walked through galleries of chained artillery and hanging cadavers marked with chalked trajectories. He walked past vault apertures where demon engines crouched upon folded limbs and listened through the stone with murder in their machine hearts. He walked between colonnades made from the prows of ancient ships, under banners woven from flayed skin and victory parchments, while unblinking lens arrays tracked every movement of his vast form and fed it into the citadel's mind. Everywhere he passed, the fortress understood. Signals flashed, orders propagated, summons bled outward through the infinite citadel like toxin through a bloodstream. By the time he entered the council chamber, they were waiting. Warsmiths, grand company tyrants, siege savants with augmetic crowns and parchment flesh, masters of demon engines with furnace brands on their faces, iron warriors in scarred plate the color of old gunmetal and dried blood, their hazard chevrons dulled by ash and old campaigns. Some bore trophies, most bore scars. None wore ease well. The chamber itself was a killing room pretending to be a place of state. It was circular, iron-walled, ribbed with closing plates thick enough to crush a battle tank flat. In its center lay a depressed strategium floor, where the target system now floated in red-gold hololithic detail. Pleasure Fortress cluster wrapped about a warp-tainted shipyard nexus, marked by drifting debris halos and traffic wounds. At the far end rose Perturabo's throne, though he did not sit upon it. No one knelt. This was not piety. It was worse. Every helm dipped, every eye lowered. They knew what mood had been called to council. Perturabo stood before them in silence, long enough for discomfort to mature into dread. At last he spoke. "He mistakes spectacle for victory," he said. "I will teach him the mathematics of extinction." The words fell into the chamber like shells into mud. No one answered at once. They all knew the name unspoken between them. Fulgrim, the Phoenician, the brother who had once smiled while using another brother as a step on the path to godhood. The old wound did not bleed in Perturabo. It calcified. It became architecture. It became a war. A hollow rune blinked and expanded above the strategium. The pleasure fortresses rotated slowly. Obscene things of gilded battlements, narcotic gardens, amphitheaters, and void-locked towers. Beyond them hung the shipyard nexus, webbed with docks, resonant spires, and ritual scars upon real space itself. They gather there, Perturabo said. Bodies, drugs, sonic relics. They rake dead worlds for ingredients as if war were a banquet and the galaxy their platter. They despoil lines of advance I have measured for centuries. They unmake utility. They waste matter. They turn conquest into appetite. One of the older warsmiths, his plate pitted and repaired so many times it resembled layered masonry, inclined his head. Then let us scour them, Lord. A punitive raid, precision butchery. We may return to the greater theatres with minimal diversion. The despoilers' wars. The chamber changed shape. There was no warning, no visible gesture. The walls simply moved. Massive iron plates shrieked inward. The old warsmith had time for half a curse before the first slab struck his shoulder. Guard and snapped him sideways. His armor screeched. Ceramite split. He tried to brace, servo limbs whining, but the chamber gave him no leverage. Another plate slammed inward from the opposite side and caught him at the hip. Metal buckled. Bone failed with a wet crack audible even through power armor. No one moved. The warsmith's vox became a burst of static and agony. One arm tore free at the pauldron and dropped to the floor in a spray of blood and hydraulic fluid. The plates closed another handspan. His torso folded. His spine went with a sound like green wood breaking in a furnace. Then the walls stopped. His ruins slid down them and lay twitching in the narrowing gutter of space, leaking red across the iron deck. Perturabo did not so much as turn his helm toward the corpse. "I am aware," he said, "of Abaddon's wars." No one spoke. He has his hungers. I have my purpose. The despoiler flings black crusades at the stars and names the noise strategy. I build a inevitability. The gate will be mine in its season. Agrippina will fall in its season. The ring will tighten in its season. This, and now he looked down upon the rotating hololith of Fulgrim's nest, is not diversion. This is correction. He lifted one clawed finger, and target runes blossomed across the system. Grand battalions recalled from the outer bastions. Siege fleets translated from the Baleward routes. Awakening rites for all bound engines presently in dormancy beneath the western furnace districts. Slave legions stripped from wall labor and branded for assault expendability. I want trench fleets, torpedo monasteries, breacher hulks, line killers, macro haulers, carrion lighters, and bombard platforms. I want the old guns unsealed. I want every store script revised to maximal expenditure. The chamber erupted into life. Vox links opened. Data serfs convulsed in their alcoves as command burdens tripled. Warsmiths barked acknowledgements in clipped Binharik and Legion cant. Herald servitors lurched from wall recesses with wax tablets, branding irons and sealed orders clamped in clawed hands. Far below, deep in the body of the citadel, claxons the size of hab blocks began to sound. Perturabo watched them all with furnace-eyed contempt. Some among them were eager, some were afraid, some hid both well. None mistook this for a raid now. They knew the scale of what had just been unleashed. Legion against legion, brother against brother. A vendetta folded into campaign geometry so vast that worlds would die without ever learning the true reason. One warsmith, bolder than wise, looked up from his slate of mobilization sigils. "Shall the pleasure fortresses be taken intact, Lord?" "No," Perturabo said. The single word was absolute. The shipyard nexus will be stripped. The fortress cluster will be broken, entered, mapped, bled, and rendered. Nothing of his aesthetic survives. Nothing that he has touched remains admirable. I want his palaces made into gun redoubts. I want his galleries ground into aggregate for trenchcrete. I want his choirs nailed into the mouths of artillery pieces so that every firing becomes their final hymn. A murmur of savage approval passed around the chamber. Perturabo let it die on its own. "You think this is vengeance," he said. No one answered, because no one wished to be wrong twice in one audience. It is not. Vengeance is emotional. This is educational. The orders went outward then in waves impossible to count. Across Medrengard, fortress gates groaned open. Dry docks bled atmosphere. Chains thicker than city bridges were hauled from magma pits as dormant engines were dragged toward wakefulness. In their vaults, demon engines opened furnace eyes and tested their limbs against restraint. Slave ranks by the million were marshaled from labor canyons and ore tombs, branded with fresh ownership sigils and loaded into hold barges until the decks ran slick with blood. Shell foundries doubled their output. Macro haulers rolled. Priests of the Dark Mechanicum began their blasphemous chants over translation drives and weapon shrines. Voidcraft that had slept for centuries beneath layers of dust, ash, and funerary cloth stirred back into war. Much later, when the chamber had emptied and the corpse had been scraped from the floor, Perturabo stood alone upon a bastion balcony and watched the first fleets rise. They climbed through Medrengard's poisoned heavens in black procession. Battleships, grand cruisers, siege arcs, slaughter barges, engine transports, ore hulks converted to troop conveyance, all wrapped in void shields and old hate. Some burned with clean drive flame, others leaked witchlight and came attended by impossible shadows moving alongside them in the upper air. The stars beyond were veiled by storm. Warp lightning webbed across a darkness the color of bruised iron. Below, the embarkation planes stretched to the horizon, billions, packed into holds. Soldiers, slaves, thralls, helots, penal stock, cult labor, vat-bred shock meat, gun crews, shell porters, digger gangs, breacher corps, an army great enough to drown continents in bodies before the first Astartes boot touched ground. Necessary, all of them. Expendable, all of them. Perturabo looked into the storm and saw perhaps no more than variables, or perhaps he saw a brother's face. The old betrayal lived there still, fossilized in memory and stronger for never having healed. Fulgrim's smile, Fulgrim's voice, the sleek contempt, the elegant theft, the moment one Primarch's vanity had fed upon another's labor and named it transcendence. Perturabo did not breathe. The thing he had become had little need for such mortal rhythms, yet he stood as if listening for one precise sound hidden within all that warp thunder. Not the cries of slaves, not the furnace roar of the fleet, not the groaning hymn of Medrengard itself. A scream. Not yet, he thought, but soon. The target system had once possessed a name fit for charts and tax ledgers, a clipped and forgettable thing used by administratum clerks and void captains. That name had been peeled from it years before, flensed away with the skin of its governors, and in its place the Phoenician sons had given it something more suitable to its present majesty and present disgrace. They called it the Choir of Syrinx. It hung in the dark, like a bruise upon reality. Its primary world was wrapped in narcotic cloud belts that glowed with sickly jewel colors, violet and fever gold and corpse pink, the vapors distilled from chem seas, where slave alchemists drowned by the thousand to refine one more exquisite intoxication for their masters. Above those clouds rose skin palaces stitched from vat-grown flesh, cured into tensile banners and translucent vaulting. Their walls breathed, their towers shivered in the cold of the upper atmosphere, pores opening and closing in vast ripples as they exhaled sweet poison into the winds. On the night side of the world, flesh gardens bloomed in terraces miles deep, forests of sculpted meat irrigated with blood and nutrient slurry, where chirurgeons in lacquered plate harvested nerve bundles and adrenal glands as carefully as a vintner selecting the best fruit from his vines. In orbit, the fortresses were worse. Opera citadels drifted in stately murder above the world, each one a fusion of palace, warship, and shrine. Their hulls were plated in polished metal, carved with scenes of triumph, degradation, and apotheosis. Gun decks hid behind colonnades of white marble and black iron. Lance batteries jutted from the mouths of giant statues whose faces were made from fused bone. Dockyards ringed the outer reaches of the system, but even these had been improved by the Emperor's children. Gunmetal had been chased into filigree. Ammunition lifts rose through galleries lined with cadavers wired into postures of adoration. Corpses hung as chandeliers. Skeletons had been gilded and arranged in devotional spirals around loading cranes. Fuel pipelines ran through cloisters of flayed skin, and labor slaves dragged munitions carts beneath frescoes painted in blood and powdered jewel. Nothing had been left merely functional. That was the first and greatest obscenity. In the void between those works drifted flotillas as sleek and predatory as blades half drawn from their sheaths. Fast attack cruisers glimmered with impossible polish. Murder frigates with prows like dueling sabers slid through dock lattices with predatory grace. Boarding craft nested in launch bays shaped like amphitheaters. There were grander ships deeper in the anchorage, hulking carriers and battle barges wearing new scars and old vanity. But even they bore themselves like noblemen entering a feast rather than engines of conquest. Vox hymns echoed between them, choirs of distortion, screams drawn out into music, music refined until it could flay, thought from the mind. Beneath it all, beneath the splendor and the vapors and the shrines and the shrieking beauty of it, the system stank of theft. Bodies had been brought here from 100 dead worlds and more. Narcotics harvested from plague moons and chem vaults. Flesh stock taken in raids. Mechanisms stolen from conquered shipyards. Resonance engines, sonic relics, rare toxins, psychotropic incenses, all of it piled high in vaults and galleries and refineries as offerings to sensation and excess. Every convoy that reached Serix made the whole dominion richer, stranger, louder, and more damned. At the heart of it all, in the loftiest orbital palace of the cluster, Fulgrim reclined and listened to the music of his realm. The chamber around him was vast enough to house a cathedral. It rose in concentric tiers, balconies and hanging bridges, woven through with silks, chains and flayed banners. Organ pipes thicker than hab corridors climbed into darkness overhead, their mouths cast in the likenesses of screaming angels, weeping saints, and laughing demons. The floor was black mirror stone, veined with silver, so polished that the court reflected upon it like some infernal underworld gathered beneath the true one. Fulgrim lay coiled upon a throne grown from ivory, pearl, and lacquered vertebrae. No mortal eye could have looked long upon him without surrendering some part of reason. Beauty still clung to him, but beauty made monstrous by excess and corruption. His torso retained the shape of impossible perfection, all sculpted muscle and pale, radiant flesh stretched over immortal grandeur, yet from the waist downward, his body descended into a vast serpentine coil, clad in scales the color of oil on water, shimmering with lilac, gold, and venom green. 4 arms adorned that upper body, each of them weapon-bearing and perfectly poised. One hand rested lightly upon the throne's curving arm. Another trailed clawed fingertips through the air, as if conducting some distant symphony. The third held a long blade, whose edge sang softly of old murders. The fourth curled around the neck of a goblet, filled not with wine, but with something darker and thicker, steaming faintly, as though still warm. His face would once have broken empires through charm alone. Now it was lovelier and fouler for the same reason. His features remained regal, fine-boned, flawless in the way only a Primarch's could be, but they had been sharpened by immortal malice. His eyes gleamed with ancient amusement and inhuman appetite. His smile promised revelation and violation in equal measure. When he moved, jewels flashed over lacquered armor plates and silk wrappings and chains of worked gold, yet none of it diminished the terrible truth that he was not dressed. He was adorned. Around him stood his court, all of them male, all of them chosen not for loyalty alone, but for their utility as instruments in the grand performance of his wars. Noise lords in decadent power armor, weighted with their sonic blasters held like instruments at rest, helms sculpted into snarling masks and saintly visages, cables running from weapon to backpack like exposed nerves. Duelists stood beside them in lacquered battleplate and flenced capes, every inch of them polished to mirror brightness, their swords thin as whispers and no less lethal. Apothecaries with gilded narthesia and chirurgical harnesses drifted among the court like morticians invited to a royal feast, trailing injector arrays, scalpels and coiling tubes. There were corrupted aristocrat slaves as well, male scions of dead dynasties and ruined courts, naked save for collars, jewels and ceremonial scars, carrying censers, narcotic braziers, wines, stimulants, living parchment, all of them trained to move with rehearsed grace. They did not serve war, they curated it. At the foot of the throne, a symphony of torment came to its climax. A choir of flayed men suspended upon silver hooks sang as electro whips kissed their exposed nerves. Their voices rose from agony into harmony. A pair of noise lords tuned the pitch with small adjustments from their gauntlet consoles. Fulgrim closed his eyes to savor the transition as raw pain became music. Then the chamber doors boomed open. A messenger entered at a run, then slowed, then remembered where he stood, and dropped to one knee so quickly that one of his kneecaps split beneath the impact. He was Astartes, though altered by service into some leaner and more elegant cruelty than a line legionary would ever permit. His armor bore the snarling eagle and coiled serpent iconography of the Emperor's children, chased in violet and gold. Blood shone upon one pauldron, not his own. "My lord," he said, head bowed. "Tidings from the marches, from the worlds beyond the gate." Fulgrim opened his eyes. Even the messenger flinched at the full warmth of that regard. "Then speak," Fulgrim said. His voice did not need to rise. It carried anyway, smooth as silk over a blade, rich with mirth and command. It did not compel by volume. It compelled because every syllable seemed to stroke the nerves directly. Men had thrown themselves into fires to hear that voice praise them. Whole populations had gone mad listening to it pronounce sentence. The messenger swallowed. Medrengard stirs. Fortress channels awaken. Grand battalions recalled. Siege fleets translated. Slave levies pressed in the billions. The Lord of Iron has taken the insult as intended. A murmur moved through the chamber, not of fear, but anticipation. Fulgrim smiled. It began as the smallest movement at one corner of his mouth. Then it widened. Then it became laughter. He threw back his head and laughed with such delighted musical cruelty that even the tortured choir on their hooks faltered in jealous awe. The sound rolled through the opera chamber and set the organ pipes humming in sympathy. The aristocrat slaves shuddered. One of them wept. Another bit. Threw his own tongue in ecstasy and knelt with blood spilling down his chin. "At last," Fulgrim said, and the smile did not leave him. "My dear brother has mistaken memory for purpose." The court laughed with him, though cautiously, measuring the exact shape of his mood. Fulgrim's merriment was never safe. It was merely beautiful. One of the duelists, a lord commander robed in flayed velvet over his gleaming plate, stepped forward and bowed. His face was bare, marked by ritual cuts across the lips and cheeks, so that his perpetual smile resembled a wound. "Permit me, Lord. If Perturabo commits himself so completely, we should strike at the head. A swift decapitation thrust into the translation lanes, sabotage his flagships, blind his siege command. A clean wound, precise, elegant." Fulgrim turned his gaze upon him. The smile remained. The warmth did not. "Clean?" he asked softly. The commander hesitated only then, and only because every warrior in the chamber heard the shift in that one word. "I meant efficient, Lord." Fulgrim uncoiled from the throne. He did not rise as mortals rose. He unfolded like revelation. Coil after jeweled coil slid across the mirror floor with the hush of silk and scales. He towered now over the nearest of his sons, over all of them, save none. His lower body circled outward in a widening loop of shimmering muscle, while his upper form leaned close enough for the commander to see his own reflection in the Primarch's eyes. "Efficient is for clerks," Fulgrim murmured. "Precise is for surgeons. Clean is for those who fear contact with consequence." One of his clawed hands caressed the commander's chin with terrible tenderness. "No, I do not want him harried. I do not want him delayed. I do not want his head taken before his heart has been properly exercised. I want him furious. I want him committed. I want him to feel the old wound split open every hour that he advances." The commander bowed. "Deeper." "As you command, Lord." Fulgrim's smile returned in full splendor, and he released him. "Prepare the system as a stage," he said, turning away. "Not a fortress. A fortress is what he understands. It would comfort him. I will not comfort him." He moved across the chamber, and his court flowed after him like a train of jeweled knives. Hide kill zones within galleries, turn beauty into crossfire, build sonic shrines into habspires and market towers. Let every avenue sing before it kills. I want the population centers rewired into living amplifiers. Thread cable through spine and sternum. Use the nervous systems. Let whole districts become instruments. When the siege guns begin their hymns, I want the cities to answer. The apothecaries bowed, already whispering to one another in delighted calculation. Fulgrim continued, "Every city taken is to die in a different manner, one in fire, one in silence, one in song, one in intoxication so exquisite that the population thanks us while its organs fail. Every defense line we abandon is to become a fresh sensation when reoccupied. Let there be no repeated note in this symphony. If he wishes to prosecute a war of remembrance, then I shall ensure that each memory tastes different." The noise lords struck their breastplates in assent. Some were already smiling behind their masks, imagining how a billion screams might be tuned. Beyond the palace, throughout the anchorage, the Emperor's children prepared in their own fashion. Fast attack flotillas slid from dock clamps and spread into the void, sleek as razors, each one bearing hunter cadres and boarding elites drilled to impossible perfection. Blade companies practiced void insertions in chambers where the walls shifted shape and gravity changed with every breath, so that no battlefield might ever surprise them. Sonic artillery was craned into concealed positions within pleasure domes, reliquary cloisters and statuary gardens. There, amplifiers hidden behind marble saints and ivory screens. In the lower docks, ritual tiers were opened in reality itself, and behind those shimmering rents waited the demons of the Dark Prince, lean-limbed and horn-crowned and trembling with eager malice, held only so long as the Rite Masters chose to hold them. All of it stood against Perturabo's coming like perfume against iron, like mockery against mathematics. Fulgrim relished the contrast. He left the chamber through a high colonnade and wound upward through the palace tower. His court knew better than to follow all the way. They remained below, spreading orders, refining cruelties, tuning the system for war. Fulgrim alone ascended to the outer heights, where the palace opened to the void behind shielded arches. From there, he could see the choir of Serix entire. The narcotic clouds glimmered below. The opera fortresses drifted in measured procession. Dockyards flashed with weapons fire as gunnery rites commenced. Farther, out, on the edge of sight, ritual tiers bled color into nothingness, while attack craft spiraled away in rehearsed patterns. It was magnificent. It was abhorrent. It was his. He coiled himself around the tower's highest spur, scales sliding over carved stone, one pair of hands resting lightly on the parapet, while another pair held blade and goblet, as though even contemplation required adornment. For a long moment, he simply watched the black distances, as if he might already glimpse Medrengard's iron fleets shouldering through the dark. When he spoke, no one stood near enough to hear, save the wind and the void. "Come," he whispered. His smile deepened. Come and show me how much hatred still fits inside that iron soul. There was no declaration of war. No herald came before the fleet. No challenge was hurled across the void. No vox cant of honor, no threat, no grand announcement to satisfy the vanity of lesser conquerors. Perturabo's answer to insult was not a speech. It was impact. The outer reaches of the choir of Serix vanished behind a blooming corona of detonations as the first moonlet struck. They had been sheared from the dead belt at the system's edge, mass-shackled, engine-braced, and driven inward under the lash of gravitic tethers. Whole chunks of frozen darkness, iron-veined and cathedral-sized, they came tumbling through the black under hissing shield skins and tides of redirected debris, each one wrapped in crude guidance arrays, each one aimed with pitiless precision toward pre-selected coordinates. They did not fall as a single storm. They fell in sequence, in angles of fire, in measured waves calculated to break traffic channels, crack orbital symmetry, and force the defenders into kill boxes not yet visible to them. The first of them shattered against an outlying opera fortress in a burst of white fire and screaming atmosphere. The second slammed through a dock lattice 3,000 leagues away, its impact folding artifice and ornament into incandescent ruin. The third never struck at all, because it was not meant to. It broke apart under shaped charges and became a rain of smaller death, each fragment screaming onward through sensor arrays, comms relays, and HAB satellites. Then came the mine nets, Iron Warriors' destroyer squadrons, translated in on pre-drawn vectors, and vomited fields of drifting ordnance into the dark. Not random, never random, but in widening geometries around the orbital cluster. Chains of void mines unfolded like metal blossoms. Hunter-killer charges drifted beneath auger shadow. Dormant torpedoes spun end over end in the black, patient as spider eggs. Flight corridors vanished. Escape routes ceased to exist. The system's elegant lanes of movement, so lovingly arranged by the Phoenician suns into spirals of procession and pleasing transit, became a lattice of invisible denial. Gravitic interdiction followed. The first signal of it came not to the eye, but to the machine spirit. Engines shuddered. Auspex returns snarled into nonsense. Void shields whined under stress from no visible source. Then space itself seemed to thicken as the Iron Warriors anchored their interdiction matrices around the major planetary bodies and the shipyard nexus, pinning translation routes in place like insects skewered to a collector's board. Ships that had counted on speed found their flanks dragged sideways by sudden mass tides. Fast attack flotillas slewed off elegant courses and into converging fire. Boarding skiffs trying to knife between mine belts shivered, stalled and died beneath compensator failure as gravity pulsed through them in brutal, artificial rhythms. Only then did the guns begin to speak in full. Mass drivers lining the forward batteries of the siege fleet opened fire in synchronized contempt. Great ferric slugs, some no smaller than shrine towers, crossed the void with all the joyless certainty of a sentence already passed. They struck Moon. Bastions, defense screens, void stations, and the outer bulwarks of the Serix dockyards in unbroken sequence. Armor plate flowered outward. Statues exploded into bone splinters and molten gold. Pressurized galleries burst and vomited frozen corpses into the dark, where they spun glittering in the light of burning ships. Opera fortresses answered in dazzling lance flashes and sheets of sonic discharge that rippled the void with rainbow-shivering distortion, but they answered too late, and into patterns Perturabo had already solved. From high command stations deep within the leading siege arc, where chained astropaths foamed blood into silver bowls, and war savants died by the minute under the weight of incoming calculations, he watched the system fold. Perturabo stood over a hololithic battlesphere, vast enough to house a cathedral choir, the armored bulk of him looming amid ranked consoles, tethered slave scribes, and iron-faced warsmiths barking casualties and corrected trajectories into vox arrays. He did not sit, he did not roar, One clawed hand moved through the spinning light of the tactical hololith, and every shift of his fingers condemned fresh populations to death. "Third ring tighter by 4 degrees," he said, and an entire battle squadron changed course in perfect obedience. "Delay the 9th bombardment spread by 11 heartbeats. They will faint into the gap." A storm of targeting runes altered. "Let them." The words were iron filings drawn across stone. The Emperor's children attempted grace in reply. Sleek cruisers detached from the inner anchorage and cut toward the siege line in fast blades of motion, their hulls lacquered and adorned, their weapon signatures bright with the promise of exquisite murder. They came in dispersed arcs, trying to turn the Iron Warrior's mass against itself, trying to open veins in the outer cordon and slip through to butcher the arteries of command. Some succeeded in breaking the first layer of fire. None survived the second. The encirclement had no wasted edge. Ring upon ring of converging range bands, overlapping fields of kill authority, interdiction zones, mine curtains, and drifting wreckage herds closed around the system with mathematical exactitude. Nothing living moved without being noticed. Nothing noticed remained free for long. Perturabo had not attacked the choir of Serix. He had solved it. Captain Damek of the Iron Brethren stood 2 tiers below the Primarch and watched that monstrous calm with the wary fascination of a warrior staring into an execution device, beautiful in its efficiency. Damek's armor was old, hammered through with scars and patched with plates taken from dead loyalists, fallen rivals, and one forgotten champion of the Long War, whose name no longer mattered. He had seen the Lord of Iron enraged before, had watched him in the old years of bitterness, when wrath still rode close to the surface, like a wound forever being touched. He keyed a private vox to the captain beside him, old Cord Varn, whose helm was split and re-riveted along one side, where some Xenos king had nearly taken his head 3 centuries before. "He looks calmer," Damek said. "Calmer than he did before the ascent." Cord did not take his eyes from the battlesphere. "That is because he no longer needs to pretend he is mortal." Damek said nothing to that. It was truth, and truth in the presence of a Primarch was often wiser left unadorned. The first world in the chain received the invasion not as a landing, but as dismemberment. Its defense moons died before its skies even understood war had begun. Iron warriors boarding torpedoes punched through their flanks, while bombardment still lit the horizonless dark outside. Breach teams entered under blankets of sparks, shrapnel, and venting atmosphere, moving through ruptured galleries and sculpted halls where the dead had been arranged as candelabra and devotional spirals. Emperors, children defenders did not hold long lines. They struck from beauty and shadow, appearing behind curtains of silken skin, from beneath mirrored floors, from organ lofts and gallery niches, blade perfect and laughing. Some slew a dozen iron warriors before being brought down. Some fought duels in the middle of compartmental collapse, while the void clawed at both warriors through torn bulkheads. It did not matter. The moons were too valuable to destroy entirely, and too exposed to save. Within hours, the Iron Warriors had gutted the command decks, vented the pleasure chapels, nailed down the airlocks, and begun remaking the defense moons into artillery bastions. Slave crews were the first through the secured breaches. Branded helots in void collars dragged prefab ferrocrete walls and munitions pallets through corridors still slick with fresh blood. Mechanicum thralls with welding limbs and flensed faces sealed hull wounds, while corpses were still cooling beside them. Macro cannon, components were craned through shattered pleasure domes. Auspex shrines were cut out and replaced by fire control altars. By the time the last Emperor's children holdouts were being smoked from ventilation vaults with chemfire and rad grenades, the moon stations were already beginning to speak with new guns, their former elegance hidden beneath hurried plate and iron scaffolds. Perturabo's sons did not merely seize terrain, they corrected it. Below, the planet's surface became a laboratory of attrition. The opening waves were mortal, billions of them, Helot soldiers in drab plate and toxin hoods stumbled down assault ramps into air made red by ash and propellant. Vat-grown labor battalions, skins stamped with infantry sigils and lungs already blackened by their birthing vats, were driven forward in blocks so dense they seemed from above like floodwater rolling across the blasted plains. Branded cult conscripts, collars sparking with pain charges, went at gunpoint into lands already mapped for death. Some carried rifles, many carried tools, most carried neither long enough to matter. They died to map defenses with their deaths. Sonic mines hidden beneath ornamental flagstones liquefied their insides and left only twitching skin bags collapsing around skeletons stripped of muscle. Chem mists rolled through the forward files and drove men to tear each other open with their teeth, while Iron Warriors' overseers marked the boundaries of contamination by the heaps of corpses. Elegant statuary gardens erupted in needle fire. Pleasure avenues that seemed abandoned collapsed into buried bunkers, from which shrieking defenders unleashed sonics, phosphor, and clouds of narcotic spores that made whole battalions kneel laughing as their organs failed. The dead were counted. The pathways of survival were noted. More waves were sent. Then the real landings began. Drop citadels hit the surface like thrown fortresses, slamming into the crust amid expanding halos of dust and broken masonry. Macro borers descended on piston towers, their adamantine drills screaming as they chewed through curtain walls and sub-level bastions alike, turning the first defense belts into clouds of powdered stone and torn metal. Magma shells from the captured moons and the siege fleet's low anchorages gouged trenches miles long through pleasure districts and hab sprawls, the molten wake of each impact igniting flesh gardens, chem reservoirs, and civilian warrens in one uninterrupted line of fire. Demonic engines were unleashed where resistance densified. They came chained in on armored haulers and were loosed with prayers that sounded like industrial accidents. Brass-bound things with furnace moors and piston limbs crashed into hab blocks and chewed through them story by story, vomiting brick, blood, and pulverized bone from grinding jaws. Others walked like mockeries of beasts, their backs crowned with cannon, their limbs ending in hydraulic claws that scooped defenders and masonry together into red ruin. They did not distinguish military from civilian. Neither did the Iron Warriors' tank lines grinding forward behind them. Treads rolled over defenders, over fleeing masses, over the wounded, over the carefully laid corpse mosaics and narcotic shrines of the Phoenician suns, until all became one paced ground into the streets. Civilians died in the billions, not by accident, not as regrettable excess. They died because they were useful in dying. Their bodies filled trenches until the trenches could be crossed. Their habs were stripped for ferrocrete and rebar to raise fresh bastions against the next district line. Their screams were logged by corrupted acousticians. Their fat went to burners, their bones to aggregate. Their nervous systems were cut from them in blocks where possible and fed into machines not yet understood by the invaders, but too suspicious to leave untouched. Whole populations were herded under bombardment into containment fields because their density made them a signal source, and signal in this war was never innocent. Yet for all the carnage, the enemy refused the comfort of a proper front. The Emperor's children vanished from obvious lines almost as soon as those lines were identified. Plazas taken at the cost of mountains of dead yielded nothing but corpses posed in fresh obscenity and chambers humming with delayed resonance charges. Tower districts abandoned in apparent panic turned out to be poisoned from cistern to ventilator. Hab tiers left undefended lured advancing helots into narcotic fog banks seeded with skin-bound speakers that whispered exquisite surrender until the battalions laid down arms and clawed out their own throats in bliss. They had seeded the whole world with deferred cruelty. A manufacturum district fell after 6 hours of grinding assault and 300,000 mortal losses, only for the victors to discover its plasma exchangers had been converted into shrines of sympathetic tone. When the Iron Warriors rolled armor through the central avenue, the resonators woke, and every tank in the lead company burst open from within as internal munitions sang themselves to detonation. A gallery line was stormed in butcher's work, room by room, level by level, until the defenders broke and fled into the underways. The Iron Warriors claimed it, fortified it, and 30 minutes later realized the walls themselves had been grown from psycho-reactive flesh impregnated with delayed hallucinogens. An entire Grand Company auxiliary tore itself apart before the vents could be sealed. Perturabo did not curse. He adjusted. "Mark all captured cultural structures for immediate disassembly," he said, and the order spread. "No aesthetic object remains intact beyond first contact. Pulverize anything decorative above the mass threshold of a child's coffin. Strip cladding. Skin the buildings to the skeleton. If they wish to hide malice within beauty, deny them beauty." His gauntlet moved across the hololith. Fire plans reoriented. Engineer battalions changed axis. Siege towers redirected to districts formerly considered secondary. Fresh mortal waves were committed into poisoned wards to overload the traps through saturation alone. Where the defenders had built sensation, Perturabo imposed exhaustion. Where they had arranged spectacle, he manufactured monotony of slaughter until even horror began to lose distinction beneath volume. The world cracked under that weight. Continents burned, oceans took ash. Civilian hive masses streamed across the plains in black trails visible from orbit, only to be intercepted, broken apart, and sorted into labor stocks or corpse fields according to immediate need. The captured moons, now already bearing the ugly, bristling silhouettes of Iron Warriors' artillery redoubts, began dropping corrected fire onto the inner hemispheres. Siege lines lengthened by the hour, not only advancing, but hardening as they went. Every mile taken was instantly fortified. Trenches dug under bombardment became bastions before the smoke dispersed. Ruins became walls. Walls became gun lines. Gun lines became feeder points for the next assault. By the end of the second day, the First World had ceased to resemble a dominion of the Emperor's children at all. It looked instead like an anatomy lesson conducted by artillery. Perturabo made planetfall at the head of the decisive push into the capital shell. He descended not in rage, nor in theatrical splendor, but amid the grinding arrival of command engines and siege armor, his bulk stepping down from a black ramp slick with ash and rain, while shells crossed overhead in luminous arcs. Around him, his chosen Terminators and Warsmith escorts advanced through a landscape of cratered plazas, collapsed choir towers, and burning habitation stacks. Defender fire slashed the air in violet pulses and shrieking crescents of sonic distortion. The rounds sparked and bled harmlessly from the Primarch's hulking plate. He did not seem hurried. He did not seem impressed. His helm tracked ranges invisible to mortal minds. He watched collapsing districts, moving reserve knots, ammunition draw, traffic pressure, even the rhythm of the enemy's traps, and he altered the war in real time as a man might alter the angle of a lamp upon a desk. Shift the 7th bombardment grid 30 spans east. The Vox repeated the order. A minute later, an avenue ahead of the advance became a river of exploding marble and liquefied defenders. Take the hab shell intact, burn the underways, collapse everything below the 3rd foundation tier. The command passed. Siege servitors obeyed. A district died by design. Bring me the palace core. It was not a roar. It was geometry-made speech. By the time the palace core fell, the defenders were already gone. Not all of them. Pockets remained, shrieking and splendid and murderous in the old way of their legion, dying with exquisite spite from balconies and hidden vaults and collapsing opera halls. But the organized resistance had withdrawn deeper into the chain, leaving behind one poisoned victory after another. Perturabo took the First World entire by nightfall of the 4th day and ordered its surviving infrastructure stripped for the next phase of advance. he stood atop the shattered command spire of what had once been the planet's greatest pleasure citadel, and watched the fires spread from horizon to horizon. Below, the conquered world groaned under the labor of immediate conversion. Guns hauled into place, trenches extending, macro batteries assembled from shipyard wreckage and moon bastion surplus. Corpses burned by the million in long ditches to deny disease what the war had already earned. The first world in the chain was his. Then the screaming changed. At first, it seemed only another note in the planet's long death, another wave of the defeated finding some fresh register of agony beneath bombardment and butchery. But the sound did not fade. It gathered. It aligned. Perturabo turned. Across the burning hemisphere, in hive ruin and trench line, in corpse field and shattered hab shell, among the dying who had not yet died and the dead whose nerves still remembered pain, the sound thickened into pattern. The vox nets filled with reports at once. Resonance spike, harmonic bleed, unknown source, civilian nervous feedback, structural vibration across all urban remains. The captured moon bastions began returning ghost echoes through their own gun housings. Then the world itself sang. Every scream of the dying, every final exhalation dragged through a ruined throat. Every bubbling plea and shell-shocked wail and animal moan from the wounded fields was seized by something unseen and drawn upward into one colossal, system-spanning note. Hive spires answered with hidden shrines, waking in their bones. Buried amplifiers beneath hab districts lit with hellish color. The trenches vibrated. The palace ruins shivered. Far above, in orbit, the opera fortresses of Serix gleamed like patient teeth as the sound was gathered and hurled outward. Not one world only, the whole system. Perturabo listened as victory announced its trap. The scream did not end. It ascended. What had begun as the ordinary harvest of a conquered world's dying became, in the space of a few heartbeats, something vast enough to stain the void. Every throat left open in the trenches, every ruptured lung clawing for one more breath beneath collapsed masonry, every penal conscript drowning in his own blood, every helot pinned under the tread of a siege carrier and made briefly immortal by pain. All of it was taken, tuned, drawn upward, and together into one colossal note. It moved through ruined hive spires and shattered hab rings like a god inhaling. It passed through the bones of the dead. It sang in the cables. It made the air itself a weapon. The first hive spire split from crown to foundation with a sound like laughter stretched upon an anvil. Its upper galleries sheared away in rings, marble and steel bursting outward in glittering clouds, while the lower megastructure remained standing for one impossible instant, cut clean through by pure resonance before gravity reclaimed it. Miles away, two Iron Warriors land raiders advancing in formation simply came apart. Their armor did not melt. It shuddered, rippled, and blew outward as the crew inside were reduced to red vapor and fragments of bone. In the trenches below the capital shell, helot battalions dropped their rifles in unison and clutched at their helmets as their teeth burst from their jaws and rattled in sprays of blood against the ferrocrete revetments. Men screamed until their eyes ruptured. Others could not scream at all because the shock had already liquefied their throats. Even sealed plate offered only the insult of delay. Within command bunkers and forward bastions, mortal officers pitched from their lecterns and beat their gauntlets against their breastplates as their organs softened inside them. Vox officers tore at their rebreathers and slumped foaming across their consoles. Iron Warriors serfs died at their stations with blood running from ears, nose, eyes, and augmetic ports alike. One siege overseer, his armor locked and his helm sealed, was found still upright after the first sonic wave had passed, both hands calmly resting on the hilt of his sidearm. Everything inside the armor from jaw to pelvis had become slurry. The command vox nets did not collapse in silence. They went mad first. every channel filled at once with shrieking distortion, voices stretched into inhuman registers, prayers becoming moans, status reports twisting into ecstatic gibberish, static flowered with hidden harmonics. Entire frequencies developed predatory life, biting through encryption layers to infest adjoining channels. One reserve commander heard his own voice, whispering obscenities back to him from a dead network for nearly a minute before the speakers burst and showered his command deck with metal fragments. A triarch of Iron Warriors signal adepts put bolter rounds through 3 whole banks of their own communications altar because the machine spirits had begun singing with dead children's voices. Perturabo stood at the summit of the shattered pleasure citadel and listened to the shape of Fulgrim's counterstroke. Below him, the first world of the chain thrashed in orchestrated agony. Above it, in the dark where the captured defense moons now wore fresh gun batteries and crude iron redoubts, new signatures blossomed across the tactical hololiths. Fast attack flotillas, assault barges, blade-wing transports shedding signal ghosts like bright scales. They had been hidden in the system's own noise, drifting behind the accumulating resonance, wrapped in the aesthetic vanities of Serix, until the signal lattice woke and made emergence into performance. The Emperor's children came down, not in solid battle lines, but in dazzling fractures of motion, refusing the front and all the useful certainty a front provided. Murder hosts fell from low orbit in silver drop shells, retro thrusters painting the night with violet fire. Boarding cadres struck not at the trenches or bastions where the Iron Warriors expected effort to be spent, but at supply arteries, artillery relay points, command vaults, ammunition silos, medici stations, orbital uplink towers, prestige targets chosen as much for insult as for worth. They struck where a wound would be seen. A munitions column 300 leagues west of the capital shell died in exquisite fashion. Its escort screens never saw the attackers until the sky opened and blade-perfect assault rams speared through the convoy from above. The attackers did not linger to grind. They slaughtered the gunners, flayed the logisticians, sabotaged the powder trains, and withdrew in time to watch the whole caravan erupt in a chain of sympathetic detonations that lit the horizon in elegant tiers of fire. Farther north, a command vault buried beneath 7 levels of ferrocrete survived the first bombardments, only to be entered by a dueling cadre that bypassed the kill corridors entirely through maintenance shafts and emerged in the strategium itself amid officers and slave scribes. They slew everyone except the commandant, and him they left hanging from his own tactical display with his jaw removed and a scroll of skin pinned to his chest, bearing a single word: unfinished. Wherever the Emperor's children struck, duels followed. Not because duels served the campaign, not because single combat could decide anything upon this scale. They erupted because the Phoenician sons hungered for witness. They wanted trophies and beauty and memory. They wanted kills that would be spoken of, envied, recreated in hallucinatory fresco, sung in the chambers of the damned. Thus, champions stepped from smoke and broken arches to issue challenges in voices purring with contempt. Thus, Iron Warriors officers advancing with measured brutality found themselves baited into sword circles, scratched upon ash and blood. Thus, corridors and plazas and burning manufactura were transformed into sudden theaters where whole battles paused for breaths at a time while 2 transhuman monsters carved at one another for no reason save appetite. An Emperor's children lord named Keyser Vale took the head of an Iron Warriors Terminator captain atop a burning hab ramp and held it aloft, while his own squad slaughtered the captain's escort in a rain of narcotic flechettes. A swordsman called the Pearl Scourge fought 6 duels in the underways of a broken hive and lost only the 7th, dying with a smile while both his hearts pumped out over a mosaic floor made from children's finger bones. One Iron Warrior's siegebreaker sergeant, cornered and outnumbered in an ammunition crypt, killed 3 of Fulgrim's chosen in succession with a chain fist and a boarding shield, before a noise marine split his spine with a note so pure his shadow remained on the wall for a second after his body fell. The war became cluttered with vanity. Fulgrim had wanted that. Warsmith Harkon Drast knew it and despised it, but contempt alone did not save him. He was one of Perturabo's old ones, a master of breach mathematics, broad as a bunker gate and armored in plate so thick it had once turned the shell burst of a macro cannon aside, long enough for him to finish a fortification line. He had held the western furnace districts during the first rise of Medrengard's walls. He had broken 6 loyalist worlds in the Cadian marches and spoken with the bitter authority of those who had earned survival. When the parley request came to his command bastion, written in perfumed code upon flayed parchment and borne by a blind herald in mirrored chains, Harkon laughed until the sound turned to a cough. "They want a performance," he said. His adjutant, a pallid siege savant with augmetic eyes set in iron sockets, bowed over the message slate. "The location is a former amphitheater built into the Equatorial Palace Quarter. They request witness and courtesy." "Then they may choke on both," Harkon said. He went anyway, not from vanity, not from hope. He went because every insult carried signal, and every signal could be exploited. He took Terminator bodyguards, Auspex adepts, a ring of gun servitors, and 3 cohorts of mortal trench clearers to lock down the surrounding galleries. He went expecting treachery. It would have amused him to say he was not disappointed. The amphitheater had once been a place of delights. Its walls were mirror glass and white stone, its stage a black circle polished to perfect reflectivity, its ascending seats packed now with enslaved spectators wired upright in restraint frames, thousands of them, men and boys stripped to the waist, throats collared, spines plugged into neural spines that fed applause reflex directly into their motor cortex. Their hands clapped until the skin split. Their mouths hung open in smiles too wide to be sane. Some were weeping while their palms beat together with the rhythm of forced admiration. At center stage stood the emissary of Fulgrim's host, a duelist in lacquered violet plate, whose face was bare and lovely, and cut with ritual scars around the mouth. "Harkon Drast," the duelist said, spreading his arms as if welcoming a guest to a feast. "How kind of you to attend." Harkon advanced no farther than the edge of the stage. "Speak your deception plainly." The duelist smiled. "Your legion takes and calls it necessity. Ours refines. Let us be honest. You are not here for words. You are here because some animal part of you hoped to be insulted to your face." Harkon lifted his combi bolter. He was dead before the first shot finished leaving the muzzle. The stage beneath him sang. Not loudly, not at first. A subtle, venomous tone rose through the black mirror and into the joints of his armor. His targeting reticule burst into flowers of static. One of his knees failed. His bolter round went high and shattered a rank of applauding slaves into red spray and broken restraint rigs. Then the hidden sonics opened fully, and the amphitheater became a killing instrument tuned for one victim alone. His bodyguards charged, but mirrored walls split apart to disgorge Emperor's children killers from every side. The duelists fell upon the Terminators, not to hold them back, but to decorate the delay. One carved an eye from a helmed face through the lens slit. Another was cut in half by a power fist and laughed through both halves until a third Iron Warrior stamped his skull flat. Harkon himself tried to force forward through the vibration, tearing his armor apart. He made 3 steps. On the 4th, his left arm came away at the shoulder in a burst of blood and cables as the resonance found a floor line in the plate. The duelist met him then, not with a speech, but with a blade through the gorget and up into the skull. When Harkon fell, the enslaved spectators clapped harder.
Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Support really helps.
The image of his death reached Perturabo 20 minutes later by hardline relay and servitor memory extraction from the single surviving gun thrall who had crawled from the amphitheater without his legs. He watched it once, no more. Around him, the command decks of the siege arc churned with revised casualty projections and collapsing signal hierarchies. A warsmith began to curse the lost veteran and the insult of the manor, but Perturabo ended the outburst with a single look. "Input the coordinates of every sympathetic sonic spike within 6 continental bands," he said. "Lord, the civilian density? Input them." Runes bloomed. Hundreds became thousands. Hidden citadels, buried shrines, resonance vaults concealed. Beneath habseas, pleasure domes, civic arteries, choir towers and corpse pits. The Emperor's children had built a nervous system into the planet and its neighboring worlds alike, and now it throbbed with every death. Perturabo's gaze did not waver. "Commit the 13th, 19th, and 42nd Mortal Corps to the marked zones." The command deck stilled. 3 entire corps, not companies, not battalions, hundreds of thousands upon hundreds of thousands each, enough flesh to drown districts. A siege savant swallowed. "To seize them, Lord? To die upon them," Perturabo said. "I require precise solution depth and harmonic return. Living mass will reveal what augurs cannot." No one argued. They had all seen what argument bought. The orders went out. The 3 corps were fed into the hidden sonic districts in converging waves, driven at gunpoint and collar pain into districts already singing with death. They disappeared by the regiment. Men burst apart in resonant fogs. Whole columns went to their knees and vomited blood before collapsing atop one another in twitching drifts. But with each obliterated cohort, data returned. Harmonic rebounds clarified. Hidden structures betrayed themselves by the ecstasy with which they killed. Perturabo watched the readouts harden into certainty. "Let him waste brilliance on surfaces," he said. "I will kill the foundations." That was how the Iron Warriors spoke in council. Verdict, ratio, tolerance, depth. Collapse probable caverns at 500 spans. Loss acceptable. Advance contingent redacted due to structural fatigue. Replace them. It was the language of pressure and expenditure, of what could be broken and what must be spent to break it. Across the intercepted Vox channels of the Emperor's children, the contrast was almost comic. "Oh, that one folded beautifully. Do you hear how the tower keens? Hold the note, brother. Hold it. No, no, not the throat. Split him lower. Let him open like fruit. Perfection requires witness." They taunted while they killed. They savored while they withdrew. Their speech was all appetite, aesthetics, contempt. They called cataclysm lovely. They named mutilation art. They laughed at the ugliness of necessity, even while hiding within it. Then the resonance tiers widened. Across the burning world and in the void above it, rents in reality opened with the obscene softness of wounds parting. Through them came the demons of the Dark Prince, lean and elegant and hideous in their grace. Clawed things with too many joints and faces, beautiful enough to inspire devotion until the teeth showed. Horned huntresses and androgynous fiends padded through gunsmoke and trench fog alike, whispering offers that broke discipline faster than artillery ever could. Men threw down weapons to touch them and died smiling. Iron Warriors' serfs turned their guns upon one another because of velvet. Voice had told them their brother's blood would sound sweeter on the ground. Even Astartes found themselves fighting on ground made uncertain not by terrain, but by desire, distraction, revulsion, and exquisite distraction again. Battlefields became fever dreams of excess, every sense amplified beyond usefulness, every instinct baited toward ruin. Perturabo authorized extermination-scale response. "Blacken the northern continent," he said, and bombardment groups answered. Cyclonic bombardment patterns crossed the upper atmosphere in incandescent curtains. Chem seas ignited. Inland waters rose into steam columns as mass drivers and plasma saturations boiled them down to mineral scars. Cities vanished under overlapping grids of high-yield fire. Pleasure forests burned white. Mountain roots broke. Entire tectonic shelves shifted under the punishment. It was not glamorous. It was not artistic. It was systematic. He did not match Fulgrim's ecstasy with ecstasy. He met it with exhaustion so vast that no delight could survive it. The world darkened beneath the ash of its own reduction. By the time the bombardment paused, continents had become blackened anatomy, seas had drawn back from vitrified shores, and the hidden sonic citadels beneath the crust were finally visible in the tactical augurs as empty places around which everything else had died. Only then did the long-range Vox come alive. No distortion, no static, no screaming choir, a single channel, clear and intimate as a whisper behind the ear. "My dear brother," Fulgrim purred, "you still build cages." Perturabo stood in the furnace glow of the strategium and looked upon the burning hololith of a ruined world. "And you," he said, "still crawl willingly into them." The bonded siege scribe called himself Larik when he still remembered being a man. That name had been burned into something smaller over the years, pared down by fear, obedience, and attrition until it meant little, more than the sum of his surviving functions. He wrote. He counted. He remembered what his masters did not wish to entrust to machine spirits alone. He followed the moving furnace of the war, close enough to smell the breath of demon engines, and far enough behind the lines to understand, in the way only mortals could, how vast the slaughter truly was. He stood now upon the lip of an excavation trench, cut through irradiated bedrock, and stared toward the horizon, where the perfect city rose. At first glance, it did not seem a city at all. It seemed an infection in the world's skin. Miles upon miles of black walls, cathedral towers, amphitheaters, pleasure domes, foundry stacks, and impossible white spires lifted from the poisoned plain in concentric layers, each ring taller than the last, until at the center there stood a vastness so intricately adorned and so mathematically wrong that the eye refused to settle upon it. The upper structures shimmered behind veils of narcotic haze. Choir towers glimmered with lilac light. Hanging gardens of flesh swayed in the chemical wind. Between the spires moved streams of gunships, barges, and blade-wing interceptors, all circling a heart no auspex could cleanly define. The outer palaces had drawn the first bombardments. The opera towers had drawn the first mass driver strikes. The ornamental bastions had invited all the obvious readings of a war citadel built by Fulgrim's sons. Yet none of those had mattered. They bled, they burned, they fell. Still the system's hidden song survived. Perturabo had looked upon the tactical remains of 3 worlds, on the sonic bleed patterns, the resonance returns, the delayed traps singing beneath the flesh of conquered districts, and had named the truth. "It is not the palace," he had said, and every warsmith in the command vault had fallen silent. "The palace is decoration. It is not the fortress. The fortress is theater. The center is beneath them both." He had moved one claw over the hololithic map, and the accumulated ruin of the campaign had shifted. Bombardment scars, signal wounds, population drains, ritual alignments, supply thefts, sonic blooms, all of them bent inward around one hidden nexus, buried below the city's beauty, like a cancer beneath powder and silk. "A forge cathedral," Perturabo had said, "a convergence engine, flesh, sound, and warped geometry, bound into one instrument." He had stared for a long moment at that unseen heart, and Larik had seen even from the edge of the chamber, from his place among the slate carriers and blood-ink servitors, that the Primarch was not merely solving a problem. He was remembering one. The perfect city, Perturabo had called it then. No one had mistaken the title for praise. Now it crouched before them, under a sky blackened by bombardment soot, and the Lord of Iron had decreed that it would not be rushed. "No storming in haste," he had said. "No indulgence, no frontal hunger. We reduce it by proper stages. We deny sky, artery, underpath, and signal. We cut, compress, excavate, seal, and break. It will die like any fortress dies, in parts. That was how the siege began. The Iron Warriors tunneled first. Not lines of men with shovels, not crude trenches clawed under fire. They sent down macro borers and subterranean breaches the size of hab blocks, plated in demon-bound adamant and screaming with heat as they bit through irradiated bedrock. Whole labor battalions were driven into the mouths of newly cut shafts, hauling support braces, coolant pipes, munition sledges, corpse render carts and sensor spines. Thousands died when the rock collapsed, or when trapped chem pockets burst into violet flame, or when the bedrock itself proved seeded with sensation mines that turned marrow to steam. More were sent. The tunnels lengthened anyway. Above ground, killbox bastions rose overnight. Laric watched them happen with the hollow disbelief of a man too tired for astonishment. One dusk, there would be nothing on a ridge but craters and corpse heaps. By the next false dawn, there would stand interlocking redoubts of ferrocrete, gunmetal, and scavenged city bone, each angle measured for overlapping fields of fire, each parapet already occupied by heavy bolters, artillery spotters, lacerets and chained servitors. Roads of crushed masonry and rendered dead linked them. Ammunition crawlers moved between them like beetles over a carcass. The Iron Warriors built while under bombardment, under sonic harassment, under blade raids. They built because that was what they did to the world. They made it into a problem with walls. They cut the city off from orbit methodically. Captured defense moons and newly anchored gun platforms hammered the upper traffic lanes. Interdiction webs tightened. Relief flotillas trying to knife through the outer belts were caught, broken, and dragged down in pieces to feed the siege lines. Blade-wing couriers vanished in the dark. Supply elevators were lanced out of the sky. Spires that had once served as orbital anchors collapsed inward under focused macro fire. Every day the perfect city grew more isolated. Every day it grew more dangerous. The defenders answered with refinements of cruelty that only Fulgrim's sons could have mistaken for wit. Laric saw the first living minefield in the eastern approach. It had looked at distance like a refugee crush, thousands of half-naked men stumbling and crawling over one another through a fog bank between the broken shell of a civic arch and a row of collapsed towers. Iron Warriors' overseers sent a helot company to clear them aside with shock mauls and fire. The first blow struck one of the wretches across the jaw and split him open from chest to groin. Not cut, opened. His skin came apart like wet paper, and inside him, every organ had been replaced with carefully nested charges, needles, phosphor packets, and resonance bulbs. He exploded. Then the bodies. Around him did the same. The street disappeared behind red vapor and spinning bone. What remained of the helots hit the ground screaming and clawing at their faces as narcotic agents released from the blast clouds entered lungs and bloodstream together. After that came the fogs. They rolled from hidden vents in perfumed banks, tinted gold, lilac and bruised blue, pooling low in streets and underways. Men who breathed them laughed first. Then they remembered things no sane mind should desire to remember, or desired things no human spirit should survive desiring. They walked smiling into mine bands. They embraced barbed wire and whispered thanks. They shot their comrades because the blood looked beautiful on the stones. Whole trench sectors had to be burned out with promethium after a single fog drift because the survivors could not be trusted to remain men. The choirs were worst. Laric heard them before he saw them. A rising human music, beautiful until the second breath, unbearable by the third. When the next assault wave went in against the lower ring bastions of the city, the hidden walls opened, and rows upon rows of flayed bodies were revealed hanging in iron frames. Thousands of living men wired throat to spine into amplification rigs, their lungs pumped by bellows, their pain regulated by electro-priests in violet armor. Each voice alone was nothing. Together they became a sonic battery. Flesh blistered in the trenches. Teeth burst. Steel sang itself apart. Then the Palatine bladesmen came from the hidden pleasure vaults beneath the line. They wore mirror-bright plate chased in gold and old blood. Their helms were sculpted into serene masks, their long swords and hooked glaives moving too fast for Larric's eye to follow cleanly. They did not charge like line soldiers. They bloomed from secret doors and subsurface shafts, exactly where the Iron Warriors had just secured their footholds, cutting commanders from the middle of their formations and leaving the rank and file to panic around corpses that had still not realized they were dead. One Palatine champion crossed 10 men in as many heartbeats and removed every head before the bodies toppled. Another fought 2 Iron Warriors sergeants at once atop a burning bunker roof, laughing through his Vox grill while their chain blades showered sparks across his jeweled cuirass. Larric wrote all of it. He wrote with his hands shaking and his lungs full of dust and funerary ash, while shells passed overhead and wounded men bled out beside his slate case. He did not write for memory alone. Perturabo's war consumed information as hungrily as bodies. Every horror was logged, indexed, compared, fed upward. The more extravagant Fulgrim's sons became, the more patterns they betrayed. That was what the Lord of Iron understood, when lesser beings saw only spectacle. One night, if night it could be called beneath skies red with distant bombardment, Larric was summoned forward with other bonded scribes to a breach zone on the western underlevels where progress had stalled. He went unwillingly, which made him no different from anyone else beneath the Iron Warriors. The breach had been opened by subterranean charges, a wound in the city's outer ring, where black stone and white ornament had collapsed into a canyon of burning debris. The assault waves sent through it had vanished twice. The third had returned as screaming fragments and armor full of blood. The fourth had simply ceased reporting. Perturabo came in person. There were moments when Larric almost forgot the Primarch was shaped like a man. This was not one of them. He came through the smoke like an engine of judgment, vast, horn-crowned, iron-plated, his every step shaking broken masonry loose from shattered facades. Around him marched Terminators and Warsmiths, but even they seemed reduced by proximity, diminished into escort pieces around some colossal war idol made animate by hatred. The breach was still singing with hidden sonics. Larric felt them in his teeth. Perturabo raised one gauntleted hand. A rays unfolded along the vast black plates of his forearm, revealing demon-forged artillery nodules, targeters glowing furnace red, runes cascading over them in fast streams of impossible calculation. He did not pause. He directed fire as he advanced. Bursts of incandescent force punched into hidden alcoves and gallery mouths before the defenders inside could strike. Walls came apart. A pleasure vault door disguised as sculpture blew inward and spat out burning bodies. Then the first Palatine bladesman met him, dropping from a balcony in a storm of silk and mirror-bright steel. Perturabo killed the first with a gravity hammer blow that turned the warrior, his armor, and half the balcony behind him into a wet crater of powdered bone and metal confetti. He caught the second by the throat and crushed him against the breach wall until the stone split. The third came in low and fast enough to blur, blade singing for the Primarch's knee joints. Perturabo stamped once. The ground beneath the duelist detonated upward in a burst of broken paving and compressed force that folded him backward until his heels touched his helm. The line surged behind the Primarch then. Iron Warriors poured through the gap under the shelter of his presence, firing upward into choir frames and hidden arches, while breacher servitors dragged shield walls into place behind him. Larric saw none of it cleanly after that. He saw flashes. Blood turned to mist in the wash of sonics. A demon engine rammed itself bodily through a pillared hall and emerged, dragging half the ceiling after it. One of Perturabo's Terminators lost both arms at the elbows and still killed 2 defenders with the grinding torque of his shoulder stumps before collapsing. The breach became a grinder in which men, Astartes, masonry, and art were all rendered toward the same end. It was in that chaos that Fulgrim first appeared. Not fully, not clearly, never where a battle line could be drawn around him. Larrick glimpsed him in pieces, as men in old epics might glimpse a serpent god between storms. A pale face smiling from a balcony thick with incense. 4 arms moving in impossible elegance through a knot of Iron Warriors veterans, each strike opening armor and man together in sprays too bright to be blood. A scaled coil flashing behind a collapsing choir frame. A voice, velvet and delighted, asking one dying champion whether he had missed his father's face as his own entrails slipped steaming through cracked plate. Then he was gone. Elsewhere in the city, moments later by the reports, he butchered a warsmith in a munitions court, then a champion pair in an undercrypt, then a whole command cell in a sealed relay sanctum without tripping a single Auspex rune. He appeared only where the humiliation would be intimate and memorable, leaving no clean tactical pattern to fix upon, no simple answer for Perturabo's hunger to solve. They entered deeper circles of the city at last. Inside, the mockery began to sharpen. Larrick did not know Idris. He knew the name only from muttered Legion memory and half-erased archival scraps, some old wound between demigods that no mortal had survived understanding in full. Yet even he could see that what lay within the inner rings was not merely a fortress or a ritual site. It was an insult engineered into architecture. A long gallery lined with white statues, half melted into elegance, each one bearing Perturabo's face, twisted by degrees into Fulgrim's smile. A chamber of suspended chains, from which hung iron masks shaped in the old 4th Legion style, each mask flayed open and gilded from within. A processional stair whose treads were forged from hazard-striped plate and inlaid with pearls and narcotic crystal, as if the Iron Warrior's blunt heraldry had been made to kneel beneath the Phoenicians' vanity. One vault held shattered siege engines, reconstructed from ivory and polished bone. Another displayed great iron hammers as erotic devotional icons, their heads cast in silver, their hafts wrapped in stretched human skin, inscribed with obscene praises to Ascension. Perturabo walked through these spaces in silence that was somehow more terrible than speech. Larrick began to understand then that Fulgrim had not simply prepared a battlefield. He had rebuilt memory into the city, one jeering chamber at a time. Everything was designed to drag the Lord of Iron back toward the old betrayal, to force him to tread its symbols, breathe its mockery, and see his own labor turned into ornament again. Deeper still waited worse things. Fusion vats filled whole transept chambers, iron cauldrons and glass wombs in which screaming bodies had been reduced, recombined and kept alive far past all reason. Men floated within, face merging to face, spine to spine, torsos opened into one another like flowering meat, their fused nervous systems threaded into silver cords that vanished into the walls. Sonic vivisection theaters rose in tiers around central slabs, where restrained captives were cut apart, not by knives alone, but by tuned notes that separated skin from muscle and muscle from bone in resonant layers, while purple-robed chirurgeons took readings. Larrick saw one chamber where chained Astartes, some dead, some not, had been sculpted into living instruments, their rib cages opened and strung with metallic tendons, their lungs worked by pistons, so that each breath produced a low note in some impossible chord. Another hall contained demon-infused surgery theaters, where brass-limbed engines reached down from the ceiling to sew warp-tainted organs into still conscious subjects, while lesser demons nested in their opened cavities like feeding birds. Even the Iron Warriors muttered at such sights, not in pity, never that, in disgust, in contempt, in the bitter recognition that some boundaries existed only so that Fulgrim's sons might dance across them. At the threshold of the innermost sanctum, resistance hardened at last into something like desperation. The defenders there were the purest of Fulgrim's chosen, armored in lacquered perfection, every movement absolute, every strike an expression of cultivated malice. They fought amid concentric vault doors and incense storms, while the hidden choirs of the deeper city screamed themselves to death around them. Perturabo broke the first ring with direct artillery from his gauntlet arrays. He breached the second with melter charges and a collapse of load pillars calculated to fall everywhere but on his own advance. He smashed the third apart by hand. Laric followed only because the men before him had nowhere else to go. Then the inner sanctum opened. The world seemed to inhale. It was not a cathedral, not holy, not a forge, not merely. It was all of those and something beyond them, a chamber so vast that its roof vanished into a darkness, lit by slow pulses of sickly gold and amaranth. Fortress metal formed its ribbing. Primarch iconography covered its walls in blasphemous relief, iron faces and serpentine halos and crowns of screaming mouths. Choir pipes thicker than hab towers rose from a floor that was not stone at all, but translucent black material beneath which something moved in tides and luminous eddies. Laric realized with a choking jolt what he was standing over. Liquefied remains, billions of them, rendered flesh and bone and nerve and memory, reduced to a vast living reservoir that sloshed beneath the floor in slow, obscene currents. From that ocean rose the engine, a colossal warp organ, if organ was the only mortal word broad enough to touch its shape. It towered in layered terraces of metal, ivory, stretched skin, screaming mouths set in brass, vast bellows worked by chained giants, and pipes formed from cathedral cannons, spinal columns, and reworked fortress towers. Its keys were battlements. Its stops were carved in the likeness of Primarch skulls. Cables of silver nerve tissue and iron vein climbed from the black reservoir below into its impossible body, while resonance crystals the size of keeps pulsed in its heart like unborn stars. The perfect city had never been the city. It had always been this. The perfect city began to die before either brother struck the first blow. Outside the inner sanctum, the war had swollen beyond all mortal accounting. Titan-scale engines strode through the burning districts above, their footfalls collapsing entire processional avenues into the underways, while their weapons lit the poisoned heavens in sheets of white ruin and amethyst distortion. Iron warriors' siege batteries hammered the city rings without pause, each discharge shaking dust and powdered bone from the sanctum vaults. Demon engines howled through breach lines, chewing through marble, flesh and armor alike. Orbital debris rained in glittering cataracts from the upper atmosphere as crippled warships and torn bastion fragments fell screaming toward the world. In the lower rings, massed infantry still slaughtered one another by the million in trenches clogged with blood, narcotic runoff, and the smashed remnants of beautiful architecture. All of that persisted. All of it remained vast, apocalyptic, impersonal. Yet in the sanctum, before the colossal warp organ and above the black reservoir of liquefied billions, the war narrowed to two sons of the Emperor and the old poison that had never once ceased moving through either of them. Fulgrim emerged from the organ's shadow as if the chamber itself had decided to become cruel. His vast serpentine body uncoiled from behind the lower terraces of the engine, scales shimmering with oil-slick color in the pulse light of the machinery. His upper form was resplendent and foul, his four arms spread in a gesture that was almost welcome, and therefore more hateful for it. Blood not his own shone in bright lacquer across his breastplate and jewel-work girdle. His face wore its familiar smile, that expression which had once won worlds, then betrayed them, then transcended betrayal into something finer and more poisonous. "Brother," Fulgrim said, and his voice flowed through the sanctum like warm venom. "You came all this way merely to prove that you can still follow a trail of humiliation." Perturabo stood amid the ruin of the breached vault, massive and black as a walking fortress, his horned helm tilted slightly upward toward the Phoenician. The artillery nodules along his gauntlets still glowed from recent discharge. Dust, blood, and shards of sonic crystal lay across his armor in drifts. Behind him, his chosen halted at the threshold, not from fear of the foe alone, but because even they understood this was no longer a chamber where warriors entered by rank. "You built this for me?" Perturabo said. Fulgrim's smile widened. "Of course I did. Who else would appreciate?" "The labor?" The warp organ moaned behind him, a note so deep it seemed to move in the bones. The black reservoir beneath the translucent floor sloshed and glimmered with currents of red and purple light. Far above, cracks spread across the sanctum ceiling as another bombardment wave struck somewhere in the upper rings. Dust drifted down like grey snow. Fulgrim moved first, not with the charge of a brute, nor even with the disciplined advance of a duelist, but with the impossibly fluid violence of a predator born into perfect confidence. One instant, he stood before the ritual engine. In the next, he was upon Perturabo in a blur of scales, gold, laughter, and flashing blades. One sword kissed sparks from the Lord of Iron's raised forearm. Another drove low for the joints beneath the abdominal plate. A third hand, clawed and pale, reached for the helm as if to caress. Perturabo did not try to match the speed. He never would. He met Fulgrim's first rush like a gate meeting a storm tide. One massive arm turned the upper blade aside. His torso twisted just enough to deny the lower strike clean purchase. Then his gravity hammer swept across the chamber in a brutal horizontal arc, not elegant, not swift by Fulgrim's standards, but vast enough that space itself seemed to thicken in its wake. Fulgrim bent backward along his serpentine spine with obscene flexibility, the hammer missing his face by less than a handspan and shattering 3 support columns behind him into blasts of powdered marble. Fulgrim laughed. "There," he purred, already sliding around Perturabo's flank. "That old honesty. No flourishes, no joy, only impact. You always did believe ugliness was a virtue." He struck again and again, never where the eye wished to follow him. A blade raked sparks down the Primarch's shoulder plate. A claw scored the hazard-striped armor over the ribs. A hooked spear from one of his lesser hands snapped out and pierced a targeting lens. He moved. Like insult made flesh, every angle selected not merely for lethality, but for memory. He wanted the Lord of Iron turning, adjusting, reacting. He wanted him driven backward before the engine that had been raised as mockery and invitation both. Perturabo gave ground by inches, and in doing so betrayed nothing except purpose. His hammer crashed into the floor rather than his brother, and the whole sanctum lurched as gravity rippled outward through the transparent black material beneath them. The blow was not aimed at flesh, it was aimed at footing. The floor buckled. Fulgrim's next glide became a momentary slip. Perturabo took that heartbeat and fired from the gauntlet arrays built into his forearm. Demon-forged shells crossed the distance at point-blank range and detonated where Fulgrim had been. The Phoenician was already above him, coiling around a leaning buttress, one blade trailing sparks down the black iron of the organ's lower choir pipes. "You are predictable," Fulgrim said. "Not in movement, in wound, in thought, in appetite. Show you an old scar, and you will spend a war licking it open." Perturabo's reply was a gauntlet shell that blew the buttress apart. Fulgrim launched clear of the explosion in a rain of jeweled masonry and severed pipework. He came down behind Perturabo, blades stabbing in toward the backplate seams. The Lord of Iron turned just enough that one thrust glanced away, but the other bit. Not deep. Not yet. Demon-forged plate shrieked as the edge carved a glowing line across it. Molten light pulsed briefly from beneath before the armor sealed again. Fulgrim saw it, and his smile became hunger. "Yes," he whispered. "There you are." The duel widened. Perturabo refused its shape every time Fulgrim tried to give it one. When the Phoenician sought a circling dance, The Lord of Iron turned it into a demolition by smashing pillars, cracking floors, and forcing both combatants to fight through, collapsing architecture. When Fulgrim tried to draw him into the open center before the colossal organ, into some symbolic arena lit by the blasphemous grandeur of the chamber, Perturabo instead drove toward the load-bearing aisles and machinery terraces, turning every exchange into a question of weight, angle, and failure points. His blows were not aimed to impress. They were aimed to deny. A retreat path crushed under fallen masonry, a support cable severed, a choir pipe sheared loose to make a wall of descending brass and flesh. He fought not as a duelist, but as a siege engine in humanoid form, each strike widening the war from a contest of bodies into an assault upon the chamber itself. Fulgrim adapted with infuriating ease. He used the ruin as if it had always been part of his design. He flowed over buckling platforms and around falling pillars, each evasion a flourish of spite. At times, he vanished behind curtains of steam and pulverized marble, only to appear where the battle became most intimate, a whisper at Perturabo's shoulder, a blade at the armpit seam, a claw across the faceplate. "You think yourself disciplined," Fulgrim said, slashing low and drawing another shower of sparks. "You think this coldness of yours is strength. It is only another form of obedience." Perturabo drove him back with a storm of gauntlet fire. "You speak of obedience? I speak of mastery." Fulgrim's laughter echoed from the vaults. This entire campaign was not for conquest, not truly, not even for sensation, though it has been delicious. It was a proof. I wanted to know whether I still held the key to you. His eyes shone with ancient malice. "I do." He moved with murderous speed then, a blur of pale limbs and serpentine force. One blade hammered against Perturabo's raised hammer haft. Another punched sparks from the gorget. A third found a seam at the side and bit into the armor with a sound like tearing iron. Fulgrim's face came close, beautiful and hateful. "You remain governable through rage." Something shifted then. For the first time in the campaign, for the first time since Medrengard, Perturabo's control slipped. It was not a mortal thing, not a snarl or a shout, but a deeper failure in the exacting architecture of his wrath. The memory Fulgrim had rebuilt into the city, the old theft, the old smile, the old labor made into another's ascent, all of it aligned in that heartbeat, and the Lord of Iron lunged not with calculation, but with hate. Fulgrim had been waiting for that. He twisted inside the blow, let the hammer pass wide, and struck. All four arms moved in one glittering atrocity. One blade hooked beneath a shoulder guard and ripped it free. Another plunged into the gap exposed along the side of the cuirass. A hooked talon tore downward through demon-forged plating, splitting black iron, engraved wards and living metal alike. Perturabo staggered as the wound opened across his torso in a line of incandescent ruin. What lay beneath the armor was not flesh, as men understood flesh. Molten, unnatural matter pulsed there. Iron and meat and warp-lit radiance fused into one seething substance that moved like magma trapped behind skin. For an instant, it was visible to the chamber, a furnace wound in the shape of a Primarch. Fulgrim exhaled in delight, as if shown some intimate masterpiece. "There," he said softly, "there is my brother." Perturabo's answering blow missed his head by a breath, and instead shattered half the terrace. Both Primarchs crashed downward through screaming pipework, falling together in a storm of fire, organ metal, and liquefied marble. They struck the lower sanctum floor hard enough to burst the black surface beneath them and spill gouts of the red, luminous reservoir into the chamber. The liquid clung to everything it touched, steaming and whispering with the last sensations of the dead. Around them, the city was coming apart. Bombardment. From above, found fresh weaknesses opened by the duel. Warp rents screamed wider in the upper galleries. Captive souls caged within the engine howled as broken resonance pathways fed them back upon themselves. Outside, Titan-scale impacts became a constant thunder. Inside, the battle turned primal. Fulgrim coiled around collapsed statuary and struck from angles no sane body should possess. Perturabo ploughed through wreckage and rivers of blood, each step turning shattered elegance into mud. They fought through fire and falling beams, through curtains of steam and red slurry, through bursts of escaping souls that tore at the eye and ear alike. Fulgrim still hunted the wound. He carved at the exposed molten line again and again, each time opening it a fraction more, each time drawing from Perturabo not pain in the mortal sense, but a flare of furnace light and a deepening of that dreadful silence which always preceded his most annihilating acts. "You cannot even suffer beautifully," Fulgrim mocked. Springing clear as a blast of artillery flame roared from Perturabo's gauntlet. "Everything about you is effort, strain, weight. Did you think Father made you to be loved? You were made to carry, to build, to be used." Perturabo halted. The sudden stillness was so absolute that even Fulgrim paused, if only for the pleasure of savoring it. The Lord of Iron turned his helm slowly, taking in the chamber not as battlefield, but as structure. The cracked vaulting, the load pillars already weakened by bombardment, the terraces supporting the colossal organ, the soul conduits braided through the walls, the reservoir fissures beneath the floor, the places where geometry had been stretched by vanity beyond all prudent tolerance. Fulgrim saw the recognition, a breath too late. "No," he said, and there was delight in it, because he understood at once what was coming. Perturabo brought the gravity hammer down with both hands, not at Fulgrim, at the sanctum. The blow hit the fractured floor and sent a catastrophic wave through the chamber's hidden mathematics. Load pillars burst from within, ceiling braces screamed and tore free. The terraces supporting the warp organ buckled in sequence, as if answering a command they had dreaded since their forging. Soul conduits snapped and released their captive power in shrieking eruptions of white-violet flame. Great ranks of choir pipes crashed from above. The engine's bellows ruptured. The black reservoir beneath the floor surged upward through widening cracks in geysers of blood-lit ruin. Fulgrim was thrown sideways by the collapse, half buried beneath a falling span of organ metal and fortress stone. He cut himself free at once, of course, carving through the avalanche with incandescent speed, but the perfection was gone. The chamber that had framed him in obscene splendor now buried him in ash, liquefied marble, shattered iconography, and the rendered dead of billions. That was Perturabo's defining cruelty, not the wound, not even the collapse. He denied the aesthetic. He ruined the ritual. He dragged Fulgrim from performance into disaster, from control into filth. The Phoenician rose from the wreckage spattered with black reservoir sludge, his scales fouled, one side of his once magnificent face marked by a gouge of molten debris. His expression, as he saw what had become of the sanctum, was not pain. It was outrage. Perturabo met him in that instant and landed the blow at last. The gravity hammer struck Fulgrim across the chest and shoulder in a burst of crushing force that folded armor, broke sacred ornament, and hurled the demon Primarch backward through the collapsing remains of his own engine. Fulgrim smashed into the organ's central ranks. 1,000 pipes detonated. Soul light erupted. Warp rents tore wide as cathedral doors. The Phoenician screamed then, not from simple hurt, but from the outrage of being made ugly. Reality peeled around him. His form wavered, grew vast, became more serpentine and less coherent as the engine's destruction ripped the ritual bindings that had steadied his manifestation. Demonic light spilled through the cracks in his body. The chamber howled with it. Fulgrim laughed even through the scream, because he was Fulgrim, and could not surrender style even to catastrophe. But the laughter was edged now, wounded, furious. "This changes nothing," he hissed, as the warp took hold of him. "You are still mine to provoke." Perturabo advanced through the collapse. molten wounds still glaring across his side, every step throwing ash and black blood aside. "No," he said. "I am simply the end of anything you build." Fulgrim's answering laughter rose into the shriek of the widening rift. Then the warp swallowed him, drawing his monstrous beauty backward through flame, broken sound, and torn geometry. His final expression remained what it had always been: amused, hateful, and proud even in defeat. When he was gone, the sanctum gave up what little coherence remained. The warp organ collapsed in totality, its terraces folding into the reservoir below. Primarch iconography shattered, choir towers plunged, the black floor split wide and vomited the liquefied remains of billions across the lower vaults. Fulgrim's chosen, feeling the loss of spectacle and center at once, began to break in the ways their legion always broke. Some fought harder, desperate to transform disaster into legend. Some turned on one another in shrieking blame. Some fled toward the upper rings seeking new stages on which to die beautifully. Their cohesion had been artifice. With the masterpiece ruined, fracture came quickly. Perturabo stood amid the annihilation, while his sons rallied to him through ash, rubble, and the failing shriek of the city. Outside, the perfect city still burned. Inside, its heart was dead. The death of the perfect city did not bring silence. Its heart collapsed in shrieking ruin, its sanctum split and drowned beneath the liquefied remains of its own offerings, its choirs choked on ash and falling stone. Yet the war did not end in any clean severing. Fulgrim's presence had been the thread that held magnificence and madness in the same knot. When that thread was torn free and dragged howling back into the warp, the Emperor's children did not break like ordinary armies. They shattered like stained glass beneath artillery. Each shard remained beautiful. Each shard remained lethal. Across the burning rings of the city and throughout the battered system beyond, warbands of the Phoenician sons split from one another in acts that were half retreat and half performance. One host turned on its fellows over the possession of a ruined sonic reliquary the size of a shrine tower, dueling atop its shattered casing, while the Iron Warriors bombarded the district around them into powdered marble. Another carved a path to an orbital lift, not to escape, but to drag. With them, a cargo of narcotics, skin scrolls, and mutilated statuary, so that their exile might not be artistically impoverished. A captain of Palatine bladesmen seized a surviving pleasure palace and barricaded himself within it, not because it could be held, but because he wished his death to occur among mirrored halls and perfumed fires, rather than in some honest trench. Noise lords fought over choirs of dying slaves, as if the choirs were treasure. Apothecaries harvested gland, nerve, and gene stock from their own fallen, while battle raged around them. Some attempted evacuation in brilliant, wasteful knife thrusts through the tightening void cordon. Some sought merely to continue the war in increasingly personal scales, raiding command cells and ammunition vaults with a fervor sharpened by humiliation. Some degenerated into feasts of mutual butchery, each warrior determined to turn the loss of a masterpiece into the creation of one final atrocity. They did not rout, they decomposed into exquisite failures. Perturabo offered them no pursuit born of triumph. He did not order the fleet forward with cries of victory. He did not hurl his sons into a fever of vengeful overreach. He did what he had always done when presented with waste, obscenity, and insult. He systematized them. The reduction of the choir of Syrinx began while the ruins of the perfect city still burned. Orders rolled out through hardline vox, command slate, and chained herald in the same cold sequence with which a siege line might be adjusted by fractions. Execution grids on every surviving world. Starvation protocols for all sealed populations. Void interdiction absolute and perpetual until further order. Atmospheric poisoning of identified refuge belts, tunnel seas, pleasure archipelagos, and narcotic cloud reserves. Orbital traffic reduction to sanctioned military convoys only. Fortress conversion schedules for all captured structures above prescribed mass and utility thresholds. Nothing was spared because it was lovely. Nothing was preserved because it had been hard to conquer. Every remaining world in Fulgrim's dominion was judged only by what it could become once stripped of pretense. The pleasure palaces went first. Across Serix Prime and its sister worlds, the White Towers, skin domes and narcotic courts that had once served as theatres of indulgence were flayed to the girders by slave labour and breacher servitors. Translucent walls of stretched flesh were burned away and replaced by blast plating. Ballrooms became shell magazines. Sensation crypts became fire control vaults. Perfume gardens were uprooted, paved over, and fitted with anti-orbital macro batteries. The upper balconies from which decadent nobles had once watched choreographed murders were widened into gun decks and bastion lips. Galleries of sculpture were smashed down and fed into trenchcrete mixers. If some fragment of old beauty could not be made useful, it was ground until the memory of it no longer existed above the level of dust. The cathedrals of excess suffered worse. Where Fulgrim's sons had raised spires of song, Perturabo raised artillery towers. Choir lofts were torn open and fitted with long barrel emplacements. Resonance chambers were gutted, lined with lead, and turned into ammunition silos. Organ pipes were cut down, recast, sleeved and mounted as bombardment tubes or signal masts. Great stained windows, showing the Phoenician in all his vile radiance, were shattered, and their coloured fragments shoveled into aggregate pits. Saints of sensation lost their faces to demolition charges and gained rangefinder arrays in their hollowed skulls. Even the bells were taken down, melted, and recast into shells. The whole realm was repurposed with a cruelty that outstripped rage precisely because it had outlasted rage. This was where Perturabo's savagery reached its coldest height. Fulgrim had tormented worlds for delight, for sensation, for the appetite of being, adored in the act of violation. Perturabo did not answer in kind. He answered by making every obscene thing serve another purpose. He denied not just the enemy's strength, but the meaning the enemy had tried to give that strength. He took all theatre and stripped it to load-bearing stone. The surviving populations were gathered and sorted. Larrick saw some of it from the slate stations raised amid the smoking bones of the perfect city, where tall iron gantries had already replaced the sanctum ruins, and labour columns were being marched in endless files beneath them. The sorting was done with the same efficiency as ammunition allotment. Men and boys were assessed by age, bone quality, visible mutation, labour capacity, augmetic compatibility, and compliance profile. Those fit for heavy toil were branded labour. Those too weak for that, but still physically intact, were fed into the fuel pits or the corpse render mills. Those with useful nervous tissue, resilient organs, or uncommon tolerances were marked graft stock and sent to the dark mechanicum annexes or the remnant chirurgical vaults. Broad-backed survivors were chained to ammunition sledges and siege crawlers as haulers. The wounded and the maimed were not discarded when wall mass was short. They became wall filler, worked into fortification mortar, trench revetments, or corpse berms according to need. No one asked whether this was just. Justice was an imperial word and a childish one. The Iron Warriors called it inventory. Execution grids webbed the remaining city rings. Those populations deemed immediately surplus were driven into measured squares and culled by rotating fire teams so that ammunition distribution could be tracked against density and terrain contamination. On the outer moons, ration denial protocols starved out sealed pleasure enclaves until the defenders within turned to cannibalism, then to ritual murder, then to ecstatic collapse, after which the bastions were taken and rebuilt. The void. Interdiction patrols closed around the surviving flotillas of the Emperor's children like jaws. Some prize ships were boarded and stripped. Most were simply broken at range and left to drift in fragments through mine nets so that the wreckage might later be recovered for hull material and munitions salvage. Whole atmospheric bands on 2 of the lesser worlds were seeded with alchemical poisons that turned the cloud layers into slow death, flushing tunnel cities and hidden pleasure caverns up into the waiting guns of the siege lines. Everywhere, completion advanced. It was during the 3rd cycle of repurposing, when the first new artillery towers opened fire from what had once been Fulgrim's favoured cathedra of sensation, that one of Perturabo's sons dared to ask the question others were too wise to give breath. The captain was called Damek, iron-faced and scarred, one of the same old breed that had watched the Lord of Iron solve systems instead of conquering them by impulse. He stood upon a viewing bastion above the remade capital shell, while below them, the last great execution grid of the lower districts was being cleared by flame and crawler. "Lord," Damek said. Perturabo did not turn from the horizon, where the skeletal remains of opera fortresses were being winched into new orbital bulwark formations. "Speak. The Phoenician has been driven off. His hosts are broken. His dominion serves your hand now. Does this satisfy vengeance?" The silence after the question was worse than anger. Far below, a demolisher shell struck some hidden undercrypt and threw a tower of fire into the red sky. Somewhere to the east, a choir vault collapsed with a sound like the death of an old animal. Perturabo watched it all without haste. "Satisfaction," he said at last, "is for the weak. Completion is enough." Damek bowed his head and did not speak again. It was the only answer there could have been. Fulgrim's insult had not been washed away. Idris had not been undone. The old theft still stood in the past exactly where it had always stood, unchanged and incurable. No world ruined here could alter that. No fortress converted, no choir silenced, no sons butchered. Vengeance had not healed the wound, because some wounds, when carried by creatures such as these, were not injuries at all. They were foundations. That was the bleak truth at the core of the victory. There was no catharsis in it, no fraternal reckoning, no sudden stillness after centuries of grievance. Perturabo had not found peace. He had found only utility. Yet utility to him was not trivial. The insult had become infrastructure. The resources Fulgrim had harvested for indulgence were now measured, indexed, and folded into the wider design of war. Shipyards once dedicated to carving gunmetal into grotesque art now launched siege monitors, munitions lighters, and breacher craft under Iron Warrior's command. Resonance engines stolen from dead. Worlds were disassembled and studied or fitted into weapon systems that might one day find use against Imperial bastions. Chem reserves, narcotic refineries, and vat flesh industries were turned toward labor sustainment, combat stimulants, and biochemical denial weapons. The outer bastions of the Choir of Serix, once ornaments in the Phoenicians' private theatre, became hard points in a growing chain of logistics and force projection aligned toward the greater march. He had denied Fulgrim the perfect war and stolen from him not only pride, but material. That mattered. In the depths of the warp, where defeat could not remain defeat for long without being dressed in some more alluring name, Fulgrim drifted through a palace that had no foundations and required none. The corridors coiled like perfume through a darkness of silk and bruised light. Laughter that might have been his own moved behind walls not yet built. Mirrors showed him in 1,000 versions, wounded in some, glorious in others, all of them desirous, all of them alive to the delicious aftertaste of outrage. The gouge upon his face was gone. The filth and ash with which Perturabo had humiliated him had been dissolved into oils, into memory, into private savour. He reclined upon a couch grown from vertebrae and pearl and watched recreations of the battle form and unform in the air before him. Here the hammer blow landed again. Here the sanctum collapsed in all its spoiled grandeur. Here the Lord of Iron, black and immense and bleeding molten light, denied perfection with the obstinacy of a beast too stubborn to appreciate beauty. Fulgrim smiled. The loss had shape. The loss had flavor. How exquisite to have forced Perturabo into that near surrender of control. How precious to have seen beneath the armor and glimpsed the furnace thing his brother had become. How maddening, and therefore how useful, that the brute had once more chosen ruin over grace, demolition over transcendence. There would be another meeting. Of that Fulgrim was certain. His brothers were not finite entertainments. They were cathedrals of trauma, each one endlessly explorable. "My dour architect," he murmured to no one, and to the many listening shadows besides. "You have made yourself interesting again." Amusement rippled through the chamber. Whether from demons, memories, or his own delight, it was impossible to say. Already the loss was becoming obsession. Back in real space, Perturabo stood within the highest command vault of the remade system and turned his attention away from Fulgrim entirely. The tactical sphere before him no longer centered on the ruins of the perfect city. Those were now only one knot in a wider net. New projections bloomed across the dark. The Cadian Gate, the approaches through the scarred marches, the hard resistance nodes of the Imperium, the forge worlds and bastion systems not yet broken, the ancient obstacle of Agrippina, the corridors of reinforcement, the places where fortresses still thought themselves durable because they had not yet been measured against his patience. Warsmiths stood in ranked silence around him, while new tonnage reports arrived from the converted shipyards of Serix. Slave yields, ammunition production curves, breacher hull completion, gun platform tonnage, atmospheric poison reserves, labor survivability ratios. All of it fed inward. All of it became future pressure. The wound Fulgrim had opened across Perturabo's torso had sealed beneath new plates and chains, but the glow beneath the armor remained. It would remain. So would the memory. He made no ceremony of either. "Vector the first reduction fleets toward the marches," he said. "Retain enough force here for continuation and extraction. The remainder joins the gate projection. I want all recovered resonance machinery translated to siege applications or rendered down. The bastions stand. The yards produce. This system is now useful." A savant bowed over his slate. "By your will, Lord." Perturabo regarded the map of the Imperium and all its stubborn walls. There were so many yet to fall. That was the final truth beneath the brother war, and beneath all wars between demigods. However intimate the wound, however ancient the hatred, the galaxy was larger than either grievance. It had room for both of them to continue, for one to savor and one to calculate, for one to seek perfection and one to impose completion, and for worlds beyond counting to be crushed between those appetites. He had not won peace. He had won momentum. Beyond the fortress glass, the remade guns of Serix fired in disciplined sequence into the void, their recoil shaking dust from stones that had once been pleasure shrines. New walls rose where old vanities had stood. Convoys formed. Slave columns marched. The long siege of the stars resumed, as if this detour through brotherhood had been only another engineering correction. And perhaps, in the scale of things, it had been. For the wound remained, the war endured, and the galaxy was vast enough to drown both their hatreds in an eternity of iron slaughter.